welcome back to the second half of the Gideon story. When last we left Gideon, he was checking his fleece. This was the second of the signs that he had asked of God, and now satisfied that his sign has been answered in the affirmative, Gideon is ready to go to war. Early in the morning, Gideon and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. This is the point at which you would expect that the army would go off into battle and come back victorious, having routed the enemy. But that's not how this particular story proceeds. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me, saying, 'My own strength has saved me.' Now announce to the army, 'Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead.'" What is this about? In Deuteronomy 28, there is a particular clause for the conduct of war, which allows the fearful to be exempt. And this is the invitation that Gideon is making to his people. If they are afraid to go into battle, they may leave. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. 22,000 is 2/3 of the army. There were just 10,000 men now willing to fight the battle. Are you noticing that as we go further into the stories of the book of Judges, both the caliber of the judge and the caliber of the people begins to deteriorate? If we have seen so far in Gideon a fearful and reluctant judge, a judge who won't budge, well, the people are not much better, are they? They are just as fearful. And now the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." What's happening now? God plans to thin out the 10,000 that remain. God wants, it appears, to have an army that can in no way boast that it is capable of winning Israel a victory. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300, who took over the provisions and the trumpets of the others. What exactly was the nature of this test? Perhaps you've heard it explained like this. Some of the 10,000 men got flat down on their stomachs and began to put their faces into the water and lap like dogs. Only 300 of these 10,000 knelt down, bent over, picked the water up in their cupped hands, and then drank. The ones that got flat down on their tummies were the ones who were careless. They were not on the lookout to see if an enemy might advance and attack them. The 300, on the other hand, were the careful, cautious ones. They kept in mind that they were soldiers who were now in enemy territory, and they made sure to hold on to their weapons with one hand, perhaps, and use the other hand to cup up the water to their lips and to drink. That's what you've heard, right? Now, Consider what the point of this exercise is. The point is that God wants to thin out the army to a number that makes it improbable and almost impossible for Israel to win the battle. If that is the case, what God wants is not a crack contingent of 300 and elite troops. He conducts most probably a thoroughly random test, a test that has nothing at all to do with capacity for battle. A random test like, for example, you might conduct if you had 10 people and you gave them each a glass with water in it and asked them to drink that water. Now, here in India, we can drink water from a glass in two ways. One way is to put the glass to our lips and then drink. Another way is to raise the glass some distance up over your mouth, tilt your head back, and pour the water into your mouth without the glass touching your lips. Now suppose that was the kind of test that God performed on these 10,000 men. A test that is in no way connected with their capacity to fight. And then randomly, He chooses those who drink one particular way. He chooses the group that is smaller. Out of 10,000, only 300 drank in one particular way. We're not sure exactly which. And that is the group that He picks. He picks the smaller and lets the much larger go. And so now what does God have? What does Gideon have? A small, diminished number of men who are willing to go to war. Just 300. And this little group is going to go and fight a thoroughly improbable, a thoroughly impossible battle. Now, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Standing up on the heights of the hills of Moreh, Gideon can look down and see the whole camp stretched out at the bottom of the valley. Thick as locusts, with war-trained camels that they have never seen the like of before, camels that cannot be counted, just as much as sand on the seashore cannot be counted. Can you imagine what's going through Gideon's head? Neither leader nor army are capable of pulling off a victory. If the leader lacks quality, the army lacks quantity. But it is the night before battle, and that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands." At this point in the other judge stories, the judge would run off down that hill slope with his men pounding after him and win that battle. But this story is different. It's almost as if God sees the look on Gideon's face, the petrified look on Gideon's face, and says to him, "If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterwards, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." God is giving Gideon yet another sign, and this time God is offering him a sign that he is not even asking for. Maybe you've noticed that in the signs that we've seen till this point, each successive sign is more elaborate than the earlier one. The first was a simple auto-combustion of an offering. The second one took 2 nights, using the fleece as a prop. Now, the sign that God assembles is grander than anything Gideon could have thought up. Watch how it goes. So Gideon and Purah his servant went down to the outposts of the camp. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, "Oh, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Here is a drama with a cast of 2 Midianite actors and 1 Israelite supporting actor in the form of Purah, a remarkable dream sequence, an explicit script, and perfectly timed scenes. There was no way Gideon could have missed the point that was being so cleverly made. Gideon was by profession a farmer, if you remember, and here is a round loaf of barley bread. Gideon is going to fall upon the Midianite camp, and even if he is only as big as a loaf of bread, he still will strike with enough force to overturn this great enemy. While he had once fearfully hid his wheat from Midian, threshing it in the winepress, now he, the loaf of bread, was going to rout the enemy. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, "Get up! The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. "Watch me," he told them. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars. Grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow, they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon!" While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. Gideon is a clever strategist. He may be a fearful judge, but once he gets on the job, he can do it. What are some clever points in this strategy? We need to know that an army in these days would be divided into small contingents or platoons, and each contingent would have 1 trumpet blower. Notice, however, in this particular strategy, each of the 300 has a trumpet. The effect will be that when the enemy, who is down in the hollow of the valley, hears these 300 trumpets all sounding at the same time from a ring that encircles the mountains above them, they will imagine that there are 300 contingents come to attack them. They will imagine that they are being confronted with an enemy that is much, much larger than it actually is. A second clever point in the strategy is that Gideon and his 300 attack at the beginning of the middle watch. Now we know that the night is divided in 2 watches, each watch being the time period for which a group of soldiers will keep lookout. At the end of their watch, they will retire to go to rest, and another set of soldiers will come in to take their place. Gideon attacks just as the guard is changing. When sleepy men have just gotten up, come in to take their places, and their eyes have still not adjusted to the night light. At that point, suddenly the hills around them are going to light up with flaring torches, and trumpets are going to sound. A third clever point in this strategy is that all 300 men will act at the same time. Because they stand at a height while the enemy is down in the valley, a concerted action by all 300 will cause the most possible degree of confusion. The shouts will echo back and forth across the valley, bouncing off the walls of the cliffs, and the enemy will be thrown into confusion. And that is exactly what happens. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Beth-shittah towards Zerera as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabath. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon even had to send messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah." I told you Gideon was a clever fellow. Even as he is pursuing the fleeing enemy, he sends out scouts running far ahead of the Midianites to ask the Ephraimites to cut off the fords of the Jordan. We remember that exactly such a strategy was used in the battle that Ehud fought against the Moabites. Once you cut off the crossing points of the Jordan, the fleeing enemy will come bang smack into you, and you will have an opportunity to kill them. Kill them by surprise even. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth Barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Orev and Zeev. They killed Orev at the rock of Orev and Zeev at the winepress of Zeev. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Orev and Zeev to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. As more men are conscripted on the spot to deal with the panicked enemy, the enemy is thoroughly routed. With this, Israel captures 2 key commanders and shakes off an enemy that was like swarms of locusts. Even their chiefs have fearsome names. Orev is the raven and Zeev is the wolf. But it is just their heads that are now brought back to Gideon, a victorious Gideon. For most of us, the Gideon story probably stops at this point. But in the book of Judges, there's a whole chapter more to come. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. Ephraim is a little put out that it hasn't been invited to join in the battle. What Ephraim had been looking for was to be able to participate in the battle so that they could also participate when the spoils of war are being handed out. Ephraim feels a little bit cheated. Watch how Gideon tackles the situation. He answers them, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Orev and Zeev, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this, their resentment against him subsided. Here is a man who not only can strategically plan battle, but can also diplomatically soothe ruffled feathers. Speaking in farmers' terms, he explains that what they've been able to get, even though they might be just comparable to gleaning, was far better than the harvest that he had got in this war. Ephraim is settled, but Gideon hasn't finished. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan and crossed it. Now Gideon's army is on the other side of the Jordan. Who are they pursuing? They are pursuing the 2 kings of Midian who have escaped. And as Gideon and his men are hot on that pursuit, they come to the city of Succoth. Gideon says to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" On the other side of the Jordan, the cities look after their own interests. They are closer to the desert, and at any point in any desert invasion, they are the ones who will catch it first. And so Sukkoth would rather keep itself on friendly terms with the desert tribes rather than put itself into an alliance with Gideon. After all, Zebah and Zalmunna have not yet been captured. Why should Sukkoth risk itself to take Gideon's side? Gideon is upset. In fact, he is much more than upset. "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." Now we are thinking to ourselves, this is not the Gideon we know. The Gideon we know is a mild and a gentle person. And here is a Gideon who is speaking of tearing people with desert thorns. Let's watch and see how the story goes. From there, Gideon went up to Peniel and made the same request of them, but they answered as the men of Sukkoth had. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I will tear down this tower." He is referring, of course, to the fortress and the tower, the watchtower, which used to be part of most cities in this time for means of protection. Gideon is swearing to tear down the protective walls and the tower around Peniel, leaving them open and vulnerable to enemy attack. We're beginning to wonder what's gone wrong with Gideon. The force that he seems to exert is disproportionate. Now, Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men, all that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordsmen had fallen. Gideon went up by the route of the nomads, east of Nobah and Jogbeha, and attacked the unsuspecting army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the 2 kings of Midian, fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. This done, now Gideon, son of Joash, returned from the battle by the pass of Hereth. He caught a young man of Sukkoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down for him the names of the 77 officials of Sukkoth, the elders of the town. And then Gideon came and said to the men of Sukkoth, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?'" And with this, Gideon took the elders of the town and taught the men of Sukkoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. And then he went to Peniel, pulled down the tower, and killed the men of the town. This is definitely not a Gideon that we know. What he does is shockingly disproportionate to their offense of non-cooperation. What is more, he is putting the leadership of Sukkoth through torture and demolishing the defenses of Peniel, obliterating its population, quite disregarding the fact that he is the leader of Israel. He is to protect his people, not bring them to such destruction at his own hands. Now we come to a part in the story when we are not going to quite understand what's going on. Gideon turns to Zebah and Zalmunna and asks a question that we won't understand. "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" Gideon asked. Men like you, they answered, each one with the bearing of a prince. Gideon replied, those were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you. Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, kill them. But Jether did not draw his sword because he was only a boy and was afraid. And Zebah and Zalmunna said, come, do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength. And so Gideon stepped forward and killed them and took the ornaments off their camels' necks. From this we understand that there has been an event in Gideon's life earlier than when we met him, threshing wheat in secret. At some point earlier to our story, Gideon's brothers were perhaps involved in a rebellion against the Midianites, and the Midianites seem to have executed them publicly, executed them on the heights of Mount Tabor. And that's why Gideon asked the question he asked. What did the men look like, the ones you killed at Tabor? And then perhaps it dawns on them, looking at the family resemblance, that Gideon is related to men they have executed. And with that, Gideon executes Zebah and Zalmunna in revenge. Only at this point, at the end of the story, are we able to piece together the personality of this reluctant leader, now turned tyrant. In the light of this family trauma, we understand Gideon's excessive fear of Midian and his secret threshing activity and his extreme reluctance to assume leadership and his need for repeated signs and miracles. Here is a man who is sorely afraid that what has happened to his older brothers will happen to him as well. But at this point, we also understand that in pushing the frontiers of war beyond the Jordan, Gideon was pursuing an agenda of personal revenge. He had won the war, and perhaps it was a good thing that he was even pursuing the kings of Midian in order to stamp out their threat for good. But what we understand at the end of the story is that his motivation was not the safety of Israel, but much more personal revenge. Gideon was acting beyond his brief as God's agent. Indeed, from this point on, he was on a slippery slope. When the story ends, we see that as much as Gideon appropriately refused kingship, he inappropriately reaped its perks. Following the stereotype of a bad king, he accumulated gold, he led the nation into idolatry, he acquired a whole harem of wives and at least one concubine. What's your takeaway from the story? This is my takeaway. You remember when we started the story, the first challenge that Gideon had was to break the shrine to Baal that was on his father's property. And this he did wonderfully well. He not only smashed down the altar of Baal, but he also broke down the Asherah pole. Asherah being the wife of Baal, you remember, the fertility goddess. He broke down the Asherah pole, used it as firewood to burn an offering of a bull. And a bull was an animal that was sacred to Baal. This is how Gideon started his career as judge-deliverer, by breaking idols. But when the story ends, Gideon has made and installed an idol. Consider if you have told yourself sometimes, now that is something that I will never do. Maybe we think that we are vulnerable only to some temptations, but we are absolutely invulnerable to some. we think we can withstand certain temptations. But the Gideon story warns us and cautions us that we can fall to any sin at some point in our lives, in some particular specific situation. A sin will overwhelm us that we thought would never be something we would do. Be careful, be cautious, be alert, the story is telling me, because the devil wanders like a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Gideon started well, but unfortunately, that was not the way he finished. He started as an idol breaker, but ended up as idol maker. In our next session, we go on to a story you've probably never heard. The story of Gideon's son Abimelech. Abimelech made himself judge, not waiting for God to choose him. Come back next session and we'll see what happens next.